Hello, everyone. I'm August Cole. I'm the director of the Art of Future Warfare project at the Atlantic Council. And today we're going to be talking about the future of urban warfare. That's looking at armed and social conflict. We're joined today by John Amble, the managing editor at War on the Rocks, Mike Tyson, who is a Atlantic Council fellow from the United States Marine Corps, and Peter Engelke, a senior fellow at the Council, who is an expert on urbanization and is part of the Strategic Foresight Initiative. So he has an excellent crystal ball. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thanks, August.
I'm going to toss the mic here to Peter first to fill us in a bit on the urbanization that we're seeing globally and where that's going, particularly when it relates to megacities.
Sure. Well, thank you, August, for having me on. I'm very excited to be part of this Google Hangout, my first Google Hangout, actually. So global urbanization is one of the, we look at it in my shop as one of the key drivers of the 21st century, one of the core demographic drivers, although, frankly, the implications of that demographic shift, meaning the movement of people from rural areas into cities almost everywhere on Earth, has implications far beyond demographic implications, including into areas ranging from economics to environment to global security issues, which is one of the things that we're here to talk about today. Why is this happening? Well, of course, cities are nothing new. Cities have been around for thousands of years, as we all know. But urbanization on a mass scale is a very new phenomenon for several complicated reasons, but they have an awful lot to do with the fact that in the modern era we simply have much greater command of natural resources and our ability to concentrate people into cities and have our food produced, frankly, by a very small percentage of all human beings is the primary driver of that phenomenon. This was a phenomenon that occurred on a mass scale first in the cities of what we call the developed world or the industrialized world starting in the 19th century. That means North America, Europe, Asia. But now is really a phenomenon, at least in terms of growth, that is occurring most rapidly in Asia and in Africa, and to a lesser extent in Latin America, the United States, and Europe.
Great.
To a far lesser extent.
John, I'm going to turn the camera on you here to have you talk a bit about, from your perspective, having served in the U.S. Army, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the experiences that you've had in urban operations and some perspective given your role at War on the Rocks and where you think the future of those sorts of missions might be going.
Well, I think there are a number of challenges that arise when you contemplate kind of a shift toward increasingly urban operations, and they range from the very basic things like simply just having trouble maintaining situational awareness in situations that are increasingly complex, to the need to power down to weapon systems that are still effective but pose a smaller risk for collateral damage. When I was in Baghdad in 2008, we had a tank battalion in our AO. Those tanks, needless to say, didn't serve much of a purpose in Baghdad and stayed parked for the duration of the battalion's 15-month deployment, and down all the way to kind of organizational challenges. We do a good job of kind of understanding that the center of gravity for our operations kind of shifts and gets pushed down lower and lower to smaller tactical units. And we talk about things like the strategic corporal, and we have task organized brigades to make them self-sustaining combat units. But really, the way that we conceptualize, kind of the borders between strategic and operational and tactical, I don't think has shifted that much. We think of, a division, I guess, as a very operational unit, and yet when I was in Baghdad, there was never an operation, truly an operation. There was coordination about what each was doing, but the planning and execution always took place at kind of the battalion level and below. I think the one event that kind of strikes home the most to me in terms of the way that I think about operating in urban environments was I was in Baghdad in 2008, and for the first couple of months of the year, we had maybe 4 or 5 SIGACs a day, IEDs, shootings, things like that. It was, frankly, about as non-operational as you can get in an operational theater, at least in retrospect and compared to what would come next. In March, what we later termed March Madness, things kicked off, and we had 60 SIGACs in our AO, which was essentially the eastern half of Baghdad in one day, and then it went up to 100, and we saw those numbers for a few weeks. And at one point, we rolled out of our FOB and to head to a joint security station about 6 miles away. We'd made that made that run many times, and it took us 9 hours to make it that sort of 6 miles. And it just shows how rapidly an urban environment can shift from permissive territory to, if not denied territory, at least heavily contested territory.
Mike, I'm going to turn the camera on you to talk a bit about that dynamic where the situation can change rapidly, and maybe you can help us understand how the Marine Corps views that issue, and from your experience, what you might add to that discussion.
Yeah, so thanks, August. And I would like to say, first off, I concur with what John has just said. He brought up great points. Collateral damage is a huge topic when you're talking urban operations, and it will continue to be. We want to preserve those key facilities, key sites within the infrastructure, be it, Iraq is the example that John already pointed to. As you even go up towards Baghdad, do you want to destroy those oil facilities, for example? Well, that may be where the enemy is, and yet if we destroy that key piece of infrastructure for that economy, then we as the United States would have to feel a responsibility to rebuild that. So how you conduct those operations, and then there's other sites, religious facilities and other historic sites that are key to that country, the economy, the tourism. Those are things you have to be concerned about, let alone the civilian population and things like that. The other thing that we continue to grapple with in today's military, and I'll like to also say these are just my own personal opinions, as opposed to DOD, but the bottom line is when we're conducting counterinsurgency, you have to expect something very different from that conventional force-on-force. Being able to identify the enemy amongst a population where they're natives becomes very difficult and challenging. So I'd hope to talk about it more as we go, but intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, things like that are critical to conducting urban operations. But without going too deep into it, August, let me turn it back to you.
Sure. Peter, one thing you've written about for the Art of Future Warfare website, you have a great Q&A to help underscore the bigger issues, but you write in that essay, in that Q&A, excuse me, that many cities are in effect without order, or in almost a sort of sub-threshold conflict metabolism already. And that presents a problem even without being in a kind of declared war zone. So maybe you could kind of talk a bit about the big cities and areas in the world right now that you see as deserving of attention in that context.
Sure. So I mean, one of the primary drivers of urban growth right now is basically slum formation, in so-called informal settlements. In many parts of the world, nobody knows how many of these exist. Some people estimate that there might be 200,000 slums in the world, containing perhaps 1 billion people, and that's going to continue into the future. We might have another 1 billion or more slum dwellers within the next 20 years. And the definition of a slum varies, but basically what it is a settlement that really doesn't have any planning or public services attached to it. And often what that means is that these are basically places that are exceedingly poorly governed by the state, and wherein, as a result, you've got situations in many places where these spaces become governance vacuums, and they are filled by basically often, not always, but certainly by criminal elements, by gangs, including gangs that have extensive transnational networks that are based on drugs, for example, or even terror networks, or even the intersection of those two things. And so this is a major problem going forward, and for the development community, but also for the security community, because what it often means, and it certainly does not always mean it, but it often means that you have kind of an ongoing chronic level of violence that is manifested through criminal activities, terror activities, and also provide the cover for organizations that engage in crime and terror can operate in these cities, and in turn those have transnational linkages. So this is a serious problem for, again, not just for the development community going forward, but for the security community.
Something, Peter, you just said about the power base being unofficial, in a sense. That really resonates because Mike and both John had talked about trying to understand better what is going on the ground in those sorts of neighborhoods or even larger parts of cities. what is the interface, for the security community in those kinds of domains? Is that something that is as difficult as it sounds?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, I think that my impression, I should say, is that going forward, if we make the assumption that urbanized conflict, and I don't want to call it necessarily warfare, but operations involving conflict or operations involving management of cities, either during a conflict, after a conflict, or after a natural disaster, by definition are going to involve basically bringing in local stakeholders, both local government officials, but also civil society leaders, frankly, in those areas. And I get the impression, and it's just an impression, that the U.S. national security apparatus is not prepared to do that, frankly, because of the scale of the problem, number one, and also the complexity of the topics at hand.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my impression.
Mike, if you were to kind of create an interface between these sorts of unofficial groups, some which are criminal and otherwise, how would that practically work for the U.S. government if it were to operate in a failing city, a different Lagos, say, than we see today?
Yeah, I think Peter points to something that's very challenging. That interface, it's a gray area, and it takes our civilian leaders to make the decisions as to how we want to approach that. What's their capacity to operate within that gray area? And what we oftentimes will divert to these days is to utilize special forces, not our conventional forces as much, because as John alluded to, there's precision weapons as opposed to those indirect fire weapons. And when I use the term indirect fire, I mean in the physical sense. However, there's just the capacity that Peter's talking about is the ability to interface with local law enforcement, other agencies that are operating within that country's native population to be able to be effective. And our special forces are more so prepared at times than our conventional forces to do that. And to recognize that gap means we have to adjust our doctrine and our training and equipment to be able to allow the breadth of our forces to operate in that urban environment as it continues to develop.
John, in talking about that ability to use nonviolent means to affect change in a zone like a failing city or an actual war zone in urban operations, from your experience, do you see any particular methods or things that you worked with or through to do that, essentially the kind of non-kinetic alternatives to shaping these environments?
Sure. While I was in Iraq, I was actually a psychological operations officer, and so this was very much what we were supposed to be doing. And I'd love to say that we were wildly successful, but it was tough work with kind of mixed results. And I think one of the problems or the reasons for that is because, as when you're talking about psychological operations or information operations, those messages that you're putting out there, those sort of non-kinetic efforts have to be targeted to a particular target audience. They just won't register with another target audience. And when you're talking about urban operations, you're talking about various kind of archipelagos of target audiences that are all overlaid with each other. And so it makes really kind of targeting, non-kinetic targeting, a difficult thing. And it's the phrase human terrain has sort of kind of lost its luster because of its association with the human terrain systems, which as a program has been criticized in some cases rightly, but that is critically important, understanding that kind of the human terrain, and that's a big enough challenge when you're in rural areas where you can kind of isolate each village and at least treat each village to some extent as kind of a monolith in some ways, because that's the way that some of these villages are organized. When you're talking about urban operations, that's just almost impossible.
Mm-hmm.
August, if I could dovetail on what John is saying, take an example of the Brits or the French operating in their former colonies. They understand that population better than other countries around the world who may find themselves operating within that country. So one way to get at it is to leverage those folks that have been operating within those countries longer. Take Africa as an example, several of the countries within that continent. To understand those populations better we're not always best suited by doing it alone, is go to those folks that have operated there much longer than the U.S., as an example, have, to be able to understand that human terrain.
Mm-hmm. You know, Mike, I mean, there's kind of a step back question. This is something that Alex Ward at the Council has brought up in an essay for national interest, and more recently, the 60% of humanity is living in cities or will be. Should we do more to prepare for urban operations?
Force presence, whether it's us or whether it's our allies and partners, or whether it's just trusting inherently the law enforcement and those other agencies within the country to be able to maintain a lid on the idiots out there. We can only do so much when it comes to that with that force presence. We grapple with dwindling budgets and having our fingerprints on things out there. And one good thing is we can do it with, as far as the U.S. goes, we can do it with our whole military, because as they're moving generally towards the coast, our Navy is going to be right there. Our Air Force will be in those airports and other places, as will our ground forces. So I think we have that going for us in a way.
Peter, let's move forward 2 to 3 decades. We'll keep it easier, maybe in the 2030s to 2040s. But what are we going to see globally? I mean, a day in the life of a megacity resident. I mean, I can't imagine that it's a homogenous existence, that there will be great variations in wealth and access to things that we consider basic human rights, like electricity, or for that matter in the future, internet access. But walk us through what urban life might be like in a megacity in the 2030s to 2040s.
Well, I think you're exactly right, first of all, that we have to acknowledge that there's great diversity. I mean, Tokyo is the world's largest city, and it is a very wealthy place and a very safe place by every measure. But that, I would argue, in 2030 will be the exception rather than the rule. The rule will look more like Karachi or Dhaka. So you're talking about very, very, very large cities that have grown very rapidly over a relatively short period of time, that have large zones or polyglot areas in the city that are very poorly governed or ungoverned, at least a low presence by the state, as I mentioned before, alongside physically interwoven with areas that are integrated into the formal economy, integrated into the planned economy, and that have people with maybe a middle class, maybe even an upper class existence. Places like Mumbai, for example, right, which has a glittering sort of downtown, very wealthy people living in it alongside slum residents, frankly. And that, I think, will look more like the norm rather than the exception going forward. There's one thing I should state, however, and that is that when we talk about slums, and I said this in my essay, it's imperative for us not to think about people who live in slums as being the problem. Rather, that it's questions of governance about how slums are governed, and therefore the kinds of incentives and disincentives to participate in the economy, to participate in society, and to participate in the politics of governance that will drive cities or parts of cities more along the lines of maybe more peacefulness or more violence going forward. And that's an absolute imperative. So we have to be thinking about governance questions when we talk about whether or not these cities are going to function, and that is ultimately what it comes down to. So in my mind, when we start talking about security issues in megacities, we have to be talking about security as it relates to development. There is no other way, in my opinion, than to think about these problems, and to think about these problems first from the standpoint of how do we achieve stable societies through a development nexus, if you will, in order to arrive at security. Mm-hmm. So that security development interface is absolutely imperative.
John, when you look at some of the technologies that the military is focusing on investing in today, and a great many that it's not, what do you see that might be relevant 20 to 30 years out in urban operations, both from a conflict perspective, but also as Peter's talking about the importance of this more strategic development?
A number of things. One, I think weapon systems that, as we talked about, are more precise and more easily targetable. Equipment that this is the MRAP, for instance, is a piece of equipment that kind of bridges kind of the security space and this the kind of contested hearts and minds space, so to speak. It did exactly what it was supposed to do in protecting soldiers from massive deep buried IEDs and VBIDs and what have you. It also, in the part of East Baghdad that I was at, tore a lot of power lines down in a city where electricity was one of the largest grievances. Again, sort of mixed results. So technologies that serve their purpose without kind of undermining our lines of operation in other spaces is critical. And also, I think, the biggest problem from a strictly security standpoint when you're operating in urban environments is that decreased situational awareness and degraded lines of sight. So any sort of technologies in kind of next generation technologies that help solve that problem are going to be huge. I think DARPA a couple of months ago started accepting proposals for a research program they're calling Reveal that essentially takes photons from one place and it moves them and reconstructs them in another place and gives you a live view of that place, of that point that you don't have direct line of sight to. Something like that would be transformational.
Mm-hmm. Mike, the tension between, I guess, it's the ability to field a generator to produce power for residents, or something that kind of creates hard security, a tank in an intersection. How do you see the military's own appetite for brokering that internal tension about what to invest in terms of development capabilities versus actual combat capabilities for the future force of the 2030s, 2040s?
Yeah, I'm positive that we're going to stay ahead of the curve. We've been doing it for a long time, and we're going to continue to develop weapon systems ahead of others because of places like DARPA and the other labs and facilities within the U.S. military and each branch of service to be able to develop those technologies that will prevent us from exposing ourselves to the enemy in such a way that we don't have the upper hand. We've seen that lower technology things like John said, the IEDs and whatnot, those things are disruptive to us, but we will continue to learn from previous examples to be able to apply those technologies and concepts to operating effectively. Unmanned systems, other things that, as we look at the third offset and we step into that, it's going to provide us the ability, and I think we'll be good at it, is developing those systems that will maintain the edge.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And if you have any final words, I can pass the mic to each of you. Perhaps you might leave us with a game or a book or a film that has helped you think a bit differently about the future of urban warfare. And John, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the film that I would point to is The Battle of Algiers, which is 50 years old next year, but I think tells us a lot both about the difficulties of operating in an intensely packed, or heavily populated urban environment like the Casbah and Algiers, and also covers very well the kind of the way that political grievances feed into security challenges. As for books, I would say there's a book called Baghdad, City of Peace, City of Blood, by a guy named Peter Engelke. We tend to think of Baghdad, I know I certainly do, I've talked about it here, in a very sort of counterinsurgency-centric context. But Baghdad is, for 15 centuries, been a kind of a flashpoint in wars of all different types. And what the book does very well is shows how cities shape the wars that are fought in them, but also how those wars shape the cities.
Great. Mike? Do you have any...
yeah, I mean...
go ahead.
No, thanks, August, and I appreciate you putting this Google Hangout together. As I wrap up, I would say, we think Terminator, right? And we're a ways off from that. But I think to be innovative, we have to think as far ahead as we can to come up with the realm of possible in operating in urban terrain. My 14-year-old daughter, I asked her this question just before, and she said, well, Divergent is probably the book is something we need to understand. Having not read the book, I'll trust that our youth are thinking ahead and they'll get us there. Great.
Peter, I'll let you close out with your comment.
Well, yes, and thank you again, August, for organizing this hangout. I would say that just from a thematic standpoint, that demography is destiny, and our future, frankly, is an urban future, and that means almost by definition that basically we're looking at more engagement in cities in issues involving conflict and reconstruction. So we need to be thinking about this more, not less, because it's going to occur more frequently in the future. I think that's a fair assumption that we can make. As far as books and other things are concerned, I mean, of course, I've read a million very, very boring reports. I would not want to recommend any of those to anyone, simply because they're wonderful for learning, but horrible for the pros, I guess. But there are a couple that stick out less facetiously. One is Mike Davis's Planet of Slums, and that is a book that admittedly has a very, very political point of view, but if you can look past the political point of view and just for the description of what we're looking at in terms of scale of the slum phenomenon globally, it's worth a read. It's shocking, if you will. And another one, sort of on the more overt conflict side, of course, is the famous book that we all know of, which is Kilcullen's Out of the Mountains, right? Which is a really discussion of how basically cities are spaces for contestation and for violence and for how to look at that equation. So,
great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your presence in our hangout here, and perhaps next time we'll all be in the same room together. With the Art of Future Warfare project, I'm August Cole, and thanks for joining us.